Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, What is Theocracy? In this video we're going to take a look at what is Islamism. Now, Islamism, at its simplest, is the belief in Islamic theocracy. Islamists argue for a government that is based on Islamic principles, that there is only one correct way to interpret Islam, that the right to rule is derived from God, not from the people, and where all Muslims are united under a single state entity. It is important to note that not all Muslims are Islamists, in the same way that not all Christians are Christian nationalists that believe in imposing Christian laws through a government. It's also important to note that there is a spectrum of Islamist beliefs, exemplified in varying Islamist political parties and groups throughout the Muslim world, with varying levels of commitment to each of the four principles we talked about above. In this video, we're going to look at the history of Islamism, and then we're going to look at each of these four tenets and the diversity of their different applications in different scenarios. Now, while the idea of Islam as a political force has long existed, Muhammad was a political leader, and his successors led a religious caliphate that spanned much of the Arab world, one can define the history of the modern conception of Islamism into three periods, largely. In the 1700s and the 1800s, there was a movement towards an Islamist revival that attempted to purge Islam of pagan cultural practices, encourage Muslims to leave areas where they were minorities and return to areas where Muslims were majorities, fight the enemies of Islam, and search for a single leader to unite the whole Muslim community behind. One such movement was the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia that eventually gave rise to the current arrangement between the Wahhabis and the Saudi royal family, where each of them provide each other a source of legitimacy. Check out our first video in this series for a little bit more on that relationship and this point in history. Now, the second period is often associated with Islamism is a reform or modernist period that happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This period was marked by opposition to some quote-unquote Western institutions such as secularism and colonialism, but acceptance of science and engineering from the West as necessary to advance. Thinkers such as Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani argued for drawing from both Islam and Western scientific advances. He argued that an Islamic state should have both its own governing laws based on Sharia law, but learn from advances in science around the world to develop. It was kind of splitting the difference of saying we should take what Islam says about morality and ethics and law and governing and justice, but accept some of the pieces that the West has developed in terms of scientific advances, engineering, etc. Rashid Rida, also associated with this period, argued for a return to a transnational caliphate and a return to a single correct form of Islam. And so we start seeing some of these precursors of the idea of Islamism as we know it today. However, the third wave of Islamism is the most relevant today, promoted by Abu al-Ala al-Mududi, Sayyid Qutb, and Ruhollah Khomeini. These thinkers critiqued democracy, secularism, and nationalism, but went further than the second wave reformers, critiquing confidence in science and technology as a means for human advancement or the gaining of knowledge. Their works went on to inspire violent Islamist groups such as Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram, and Khomeini led the revolution in Iran, which turned it into a theocratic state based on these ideas and principles. Now, the first and arguably most important feature of Islamism is its commitment to theocracy, in the sense that Islamists believe that laws should be based on the Quran and, to varying extents, the Sunnah and the Hadith, which include the sayings and deeds of Muhammad. In other words, Islamists hold that the laws of a country should be based on Sharia law. Most Islamist parties hold some version of this idea, that country laws should be based on religious laws, either directly or indirectly. Some Islamist parties, like Turkey's AKP, have in the past taken Islam only as a guiding moral compass and not a direct dictate into law, but in recent years have shifted to include more Islamist nationalist positions in their party's platform. The second key component of Islamism is the idea of religious exclusivism. This is essentially the claim that there's only one very specific right way to be a Muslim, and all other ways are equivalent to heresy. This exclusivism is in some ways required to support the idea of imposing Islamic law through the state, as if there were multiple good ways to be a Muslim, we can't ethically legislate one version over another. This viewpoint also claims that inherent in Islam is the idea of Islamism, and any Muslim that opposes Islamism, that for example supports pluralism or that thinks that Islam should be separate from the state or supports a secular state, is not a true Muslim. This often can lead to sectarian conflict and violence when pluralist Muslims who accept that there are many ways to be a good Muslim and would prefer a state that's separate from religion, or Islamists that have different interpretations of the Quran, are placed under an Islamist regime that views them as not real Muslims or, in fact, the enemy. This idea of exclusivism is sometimes, though not always, justified with reference to an underlying narrative of a battle between good Muslims and evil heretics. In order to make such a distinction, Islamists need to have a clear delineation between the correct version of Islam and everyone else. Islamism is, in many ways, a rejection of quote-unquote Western ideas of nation-states, democracy, multiculturalism, and human rights, in part due to post-colonial failures of some of these institutions in the Islamic world. However, as with many types of communitarian nationalism, this idea of a bifurcated world, us and them, with the good on one side and the evil on the other, becomes harder to justify as more Muslims are living in and participating in societies in Europe and the US that have more secular governments and are accepting those governments, and by Islamists, therefore, are not true Muslims. And as there are many religious minorities that continue to live in Muslim countries and therefore by an Islamic framing either need to be converted or kicked out. It's worthy to note that this moralization has varying levels depending on the particular type of Islamism. Some focus on the evil of the systems, of democracy, multiculturalism, etc., but don't classify the people in those systems or even the people that participate in them as necessarily evil, or nor do they encourage harm against them, while others, more violent Islamists, actively justify violence against people in those systems through this good versus evil narrative. So, as with anything, there's a wide range of views that get classified under Islamism. So simply because something is Islamist doesn't necessarily mean that it falls into this kind of good versus evil narrative, though it is a common rhetorical device that's often used. A third key component of Islamism is the idea of divine right to rule. This stands in clear opposition to the views of many Enlightenment philosophers, such as John Locke, who argued in favor of more democratic forms of government, as, to Locke, the right to rule derives from the consent of the governed. For the Islamist, the right to rule is given by God, not through democracy. Based on this, some Islamist groups attempt to gain power through non-democratic or violent means. Others function as political parties that promise explicitly or implicitly to overthrow the democracy that elected them, as we've seen with non-Islamist populist leaders around the world who have authoritarian or anti-democratic bents and who try to get elected for the purpose of dismantling some of that democracy that put them into power. Others still try to reconcile these views, arguing that democracy is in fact required to allow the people to choose the stewards that would most effectively implement the will of God. In other words, what they're arguing is that while God gives leaders the moral right to rule, it is through the method of democracy that the people can choose the most faithful servants of God. And so, as with the other pieces of this, there's a wide spectrum. There are some Islamist parties that are clearly, to a certain degree, active support of democracy, arguing that democracy is the right method for finding the people who will best enact the will of God, whereas others find it completely opposed or antithetical to the idea of Islamism. The final key component of Islamism is its transnational nature. One concern that Islamists have with the colonial legacy in the Middle East is the fact that Arab lands were divided into many separate states, weakening their collective power and dividing the Muslim ummah, or community. Islamists are opposed to this idea of nation-states as the chief political entity instead of an overarching religious caliphate. In their rhetoric, Islamists imagine uniting all Muslim countries together into a single state or caliphate. They advocate for Muslims that have left Muslim countries to return and for religious minorities in Muslim states to be expelled. Should sound familiar if you've seen our videos on communitarian nationalism. This links to the idea that all the good Muslims uniting in a single homeland and all the evil non-believers being sent elsewhere, though it's not necessarily part of it. This is part of a hearkening back to the perceived golden age following the death of Muhammad, when much of the Islamic world was united under a single leader, though this history is much more complicated and less unified than Islamists might have us believe. While this appears in rhetoric, it is rarely, if ever, attempted in practice. This vision of a transnational Islamic state is inherently at odds with the ideas of exclusivism, of only one version of Islam being correct, and the empirical fact that there's a great deal of disagreement as to what the correct version of Islam should be in different countries, many of which are not Arab, ranging from Indonesia to Senegal. In practice, most Islamist political parties focused on national concerns, much more than trying to create a transnational state, though they may give lip service to it in speeches. That said, some violent Islamic groups, such as ISIS or Daesh, have attempted to create cross-border states in the past, or coalitions of violent groups around the world have attempted to create Islamist revolutions in many different countries all at the same time. However, these have had only marginal or temporary success. This brings us to the question of violence. Islamism is commonly associated with terrorism or overt acts of violence that attempt to create an Islamic state, attack the enemies of Islam either in the West or in Muslims that don't accept that particular brand of Islamism, or to overthrow democracy in a given country. However, this is not the only kind of Islamism. Many Islamist parties use very divisive rhetoric without actively advocating violence or even the overthrow of democracies within their own country. Some of this is connected to the relationship between Islamism and democracy. Those groups that think that Islamism can function within a democracy or can use democracy to bring about an Islamic state are less likely to use violence to achieve goals that they think can be settled at the ballot box, while those that reject even the idea of using democracy to subvert democracy are more likely to resort to violence. While violence is not inherent to Islamism, and many Islamist organizations are peaceful, there are many characteristics of this movement that give it the potential to turn violent. The rejection of pluralism requires Islamists to insist on their particular version of Islam. As we have seen in our video on faith and violence, disputes around faith are inherently irrational, without violence in a way that rational disputes are not. Pluralism allows for irreconcilable differences to coexist without violence. Exclusivism does not. And so this exclusivist bent to the religion requires a certain level of, if not violence, active fighting and disputes with each other that can't be resolved through rational means. The rejection of democracy similarly eliminates another nonviolent method for settling disagreements. If you don't believe that something can either be settled rationally or at the ballot box because you believe in different holy texts and you think democracy is a bad thing, there's not that much other than violence you can use to resolve that disagreement. Finally, the narrative of uniting all of the good Muslims against the evil non-believers plays into the idea of a holy war against non-believers and can lead to the dehumanization of non-Muslims, making it seem more justifiable to do violence against them. It's worthy of note that there are some Islamist movements that have gone in the other direction, to the point of no longer identifying as Islamists themselves. The Tunisian Islamist party, Ennahda, gained power through democracy, enacting a secular constitution, and eventually stopped identifying as Islamist, though Tunisia has since experienced significant democratic backsliding, not due to Islamism, but due to a slow coup attempted by the independent president of Kais Saied. A challenge for any philosophical defense of Islamism is that it relies on the truth of Islamic texts, which most non-Muslims see no reason to believe. We might level other secular objections, such as an incentive towards violence, the disenfranchisement of minority non-Muslim communities, pluralist opposition to exclusivism, etc., democratic opposition to theocracy, and so on. But many of these objections have been leveled at other forms of theocracy that we've already seen in this series, so we aren't going to dwell on them here. What we will look at is this crucial challenge, this critical challenge of any political project that's founded on religion, the irreconcilability of disputes. Whether those disputes are between a non-Muslim and an Islamist, or two Islamists that have different viewpoints, which they think are correct, without a decision framework like democracy, these disputes cannot be resolved. This is to a certain degree why many Islamists want there to be a single political body that is able to give the true definition of Islam or back up a true factual definition of Islam, because they need a decision framework within a religious context to say what is the correct interpretation, what is the wrong interpretation. The problem, as we see with the diversity of religious views in any religion, not just Islam, but Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, what have you, these still, even when you have a single religious authority like a pope, there are plenty of people who are not Catholics, or even within Catholicism, who disagree with that pope or have different interpretations. And so because lacking that single religious authority, you aren't able to resolve disputes, and because of the existence of diverse views, you're never going to get back to having a single religious authority. You have problems that can't be resolved through democracy, they can't be resolved through rationality, and they can't be resolved through authoritarian decision. This gives the propensity towards the possibility of violence because you have these irreconcilable disputes. This also means that despite Islamism sometimes being touted as having quote-unquote small r Republican benefits of the clergy providing a check on the state, in practice, the variety of potential interpretations of any religion can result in leaders doing as they wish, then finding some passage in a religious text that will justify it. Given the many contradictions in religious texts, this isn't hard. The problem is not that Islam is inherently anti-democratic or violent, but rather that Islamism creates a system more prone to using violence as a political mechanism and less responsive to the will of the people or rationality, particularly less responsive to the will of non-Muslim minorities. What do you think? Are there some versions of Islamism that seem palatable? At what point does a political party that accepts democracy and pluralist society stop really being Islamist? Is the word too broad to have meaning when it encompasses both political parties that accept and want to function within democracies and rogue terrorist rebellions that are trying to impose an Islamic state by force? Should we have different terms for violent Islamist groups and Islamist political parties that might express similar goals but disagree on the means? Or is there some component of being Islamist that is essentially always going to be in tension with the idea of democracy, and these political parties that try to reconcile these things are simply fighting a losing battle? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date on future videos. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.